welcome to another episode of Metis Time Capsule. I'm your host, Alexandria Anthony. Today is a subject matter that is very important to me, having strong Métis women in our kinship and community. And Métis women were integral to the fur trade, and they were sought after as marriage partners for fur trade managers because of course, their kinship ties to local First Nations and Métis. Some English Métis women, known as country-born, married high-ranking officials and became members of the Red River aristocracy. And French Métis women were likely to marry fur trade laborers such as French Canadian voyageurs. And their work was so vitally important as they provided food such as garden produce, berries, fish, and game to the fur trade posts. And they also made and sold hand-worked items such as sashes and quilts, folks. Métis matriarchs truly represent an important aspect in the construction of our nation, as did the roles of other Métis women. And for those who may not know, matriarchy is a social system in which women hold the primary power positions in roles of authority, and they help keep our Métis history and culture alive. And in the celebration of the power and the grace of strong Métis women, it is an honor to share with you the life story and achievements of Anne McDermot-Bannatyne. Also, some people call her Annie. So, Anne Bannatyne was one of the Métis, and they call her, I quote, First Ladies, end of quote, of the Red River. Anne was born into a life of relative privilege at the Red River settlement in Manitoba, and according to her scrip affidavit, her date of birth was November 12th, 1832. And her parents were Andrew Miles McDermott, and he was an Irish Catholic successful merchant at Red River, and of course her mother, Sarah Mary McNabb, who was a Métis, and she was the fifth daughter of 9 girls and 6 boys who survived infancy. And Anne was the younger sister of Mary Sarah, or Sally McDermott, who would become the wife of the Hudson Bay Company governor, William McTavish, and reside at Upper Fort Garry during 1869 to 1870. And part, if not all of her childhood, would have been spent at Emerald Lodge, also known as Emerald Grove, and the residence and store built a few hundred yards north of Fort Garry. W.J. Healy records a description of the house by one of his granddaughters, and I quote, "It was a very large 2-story house built of logs with weatherboard on top, and it was plastered inside. A hallway ran down the middle with 2 large rooms on each side of it at the front. There were fireplaces of mud, which were afterwards of brick, in each of those rooms, and the bedrooms upstairs were heated by Karen box stoves. There was good walnut furniture in the living room and some heavy chairs and other things," end of quote. And Anne lived in what was most likely one of the most prestigious buildings in the country, but it was clearly not up to Eastern Eastern Canada standards, and many travelers from across the continent spent the night at Emerald Lodge, and which was the unofficial hotel of Red River. And hear stories of danger and adventure that likely made an impression on the young Anne, and which probably contributed to her wanderlust. And not much is noted about her childhood because their family was not a subject that at that time interested contemporary writers such as Alexander Ross. And Anne's upbringing would not have been as rigorous as many of the other Métis children in the settlement. It was not as severe as the Métis children who accompanied their parents, of course, on the semi-annual buffalo hunts, where they would participate in the dressing of buffalo robes and, of course, the making of pemmican. And there appears to be sparse evidence to show where she attended school, but it is conceded generally that Anne indeed was educated. Her long association with the Catholic Church at St. Boniface may suggest to some that she was schooled in the tenets of that faith. It could also be possible she was taught at home as her father had been. And there has also been a speculation as to whether Andrew Bannatyne married Anne McDermott out of love. We may never know that. We may never know that for certain. And though she would have some choice in the matter, that was limited to men of a certain class and subject, of course, to parental approval, as well as fur trading families often intermarried with one another to strengthen their business ties. So Anne married Andrew Graham Ballandin Ballantyne on August 19th, 1851, and originally Andrew was originally of the Orkney Islands and was formerly of the Hudson Bay Company. And Ballantyne, like his father-in-law, made his fortune as an independent merchant at Red River. And for a short time after their wedding, Anne and her husband apparently lived at their parents' home at Emerald Grove, located a little over a kilometer north of Fort Garry to the east side of Main Street, where a larger house, Emerald Lodge, was built in the 1850s. And on September 26, 1852, Anne's first son, John Bannatyne, was born. And although he would spend the rest of his life in Red River, Ballantyne became what would later be called, and this is a term we're familiar with today, and snowbird. And his first opportunity to avoid the harsh Manitoba climate came during the winter of 1853 to 1854, where he took his wife and his infant son to Scotland to escape, of course, the harsh Manitoba winter. Tragically, the young John died during the journey on November 24th, 1853, and he was buried in Edinburgh, Scotland. And although it was common to have large families with the expectation that a few children sadly would not survive to adulthood, Anne would end up outliving 7 out of her 10 children. And Anne's skills as an entertainer learnt, of course, in the McDermott family home. Tending to traveling dignitaries were put to good use as her husband really rose to prominence. And Bannatyne was a business success. He soon had his own store built on a river lot right next to his father-in-law, and Bannatyne's success as a free trader soon brought him to the attention of the company he so loathed. And in 1857, he went north to Norway House to trade, but he was arrested and sent back to Red River for violating the Hudson Bay Company's trading monopoly. And however, there would be no repeat, of course, of the Sayre trial because Governor McTavish released Bannatyne soon after his arrival. And he was now able to continue his trading practices unfettered, and he continued his rise in prominence. And by 1867, Bannatyne's skill and business sense had brought him to the top of the Red River merchant hierarchy. And of course, as mistress of the house, Anne would have been the one who made the abode comfortable and who provided most of the hospitality. And by this time, she was renowned throughout Red River for her hospitality and friendliness. So she was well known at that time. Her role as hostess in the dinner to celebrate the establishment of a Freemasons lodge was just one of the examples of how Anne Bannatyne's position was to be found firmly amongst the creme de la creme of the Red River settlement. And she did not, however, use her position to merely put on appearances. That's very important, and that's a testament to her character. And their new home had been constructed during the 1860s as their family rapidly grew. And Lorinda was born October 26, 1862, William August 14th or 16th, 1864, and Robert May 4th, either 1867 or 1868. And the Bannatynes' residence was situated just behind their store at the northeast corner of the intersections of the Portage Trail with the main road through the town at that time of Winnipeg. And she always dressed beautifully and was very vicarious, and she was admired as a gracious hostess of the grand dinner party gatherings, who was also and it was also known that Anne was given to good work. So of course she always tried to pay it forward, as we say it in these days. The family business was now housed in a newly built brick building, and there Anne held the annual Ladies' Bazaar to raise money for the poor. In combination with the proceeds from a concert the women's organization raised at that time, £100 sterling, which was in 1867, and the previous year they had raised and distributed 60 or 70 pounds sterling. Anne at that time became a real leading force in the early efforts of Red River philanthropy, and this would become a lifelong passion with Anne. And these activities were typical for wealthy women of that particular time. Early one day, and this is early one day, this is when her Anne's story becomes very, very interesting, important to Métis women, Métis people out there. So early one day in February 1869, Anne really stepped outside her gender role and committed a single act of resistance that really put a fire that really fired the imagination of, at that time, a young Louis Riel, an act which is still remembered by many Manitobans to this day. And although Anne was involved in many charitable causes, what is remembered most about her was her, and this really says a lot. And her horse whipping of Charles Mayer. And Charles Mayer was an anti-Métis member of the Canada First Party. He was a racist, a bigot, and a rabble-rouser in the Red River settlement. And it's really sad that at that particular time that there were so many uh, racist discrimination, bigots against Métis at the Red River settlement. And Mayer had written a letter published in the Toronto Globe, really making disparaging remarks about, and I quote, half-breed, end of quote, women and Red River society. And Bannatyne read the letter, and she really vowed to herself to humiliate this man. And Anne Bannatyne was not a woman that you wanted to cross for sure. And when Mayer wrote those disparaging things about Métis women, Anne didn't even get mad. She didn't get mad. She got even. And Charles Mayer wrote letters to his brothers in Ontario, who sent them, of course, to newspapers making fun of the people and Red River. And I'll read just a little bit of an expert of this, and so you can see for yourself how really this person, just a real piece of work in his particular time. And this is something that Charles Mayer wrote. He had written about a social evening at the Red River settlement, and I quote, "I was invited to a dinner party at Beth's, where I found the governor's brother-in-law, a wealthy merchant there, and were to assume A.G.B. Bannatyne, Abister, possibly William Abister, married to Mary Ann Begg, and other Nor'westerners. Although I received hospitality to my heart's content, and I left the place thoroughly pleased with most that I had met, there are jealousies and heartburnings, however. Many wealthy people are married to half-breed women who, having no coat of arms but a totem to look back to, make up for the deficiency by biting the backs of their white sisters. The white sisters fall back upon their whiteness, whilst the husbands treat each other with desperate courtesies and hospitalities, with a view to filthy liquor in the background." Can you imagine? End of quote. Can you imagine that statement? And really getting that sent to newspapers about his racial and bigotry against Métis, and his wording were half-breed. And at that time, you have to remember also in 1867, it was an atmosphere of simmering tensions between various groups in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Mayer had began to write accounts of his trips to the prairies. And these particular accounts repeatedly insulted Métis women and Red River society. And really, perhaps Mayer assumed that the Globe newspaper would not make its way to the Red River. And regardless, he quite suddenly found himself, no longer welcome, a, a guest in the houses of the local upper crust. And when he had the audacity to show his face at Anne's general store, and took a horse, and this is where it really gets interesting, and she's got a lot of guts, and this really showcases strong Métis women. Anne took a horsewhip down from the wall and taught the young writer a lesson in respect. And I think there's several accounts on this particular incident, but Father George Dugas, St. Boniface priest, really described how Anne taught Mare a lesson in such a spectacular fashion. And before we start this account, maybe close your eyes, and if you can certainly visualize a strong Métis woman. And I quote, she ordered the clerk of her husband's store, where the post office was located, to come and warn her when Mayor arrived to collect his letters and newspapers, as he did every Saturday. Therefore, on Saturday at 4 in the afternoon, while the store was full of people, Daniel Mulligan, the clerk, having seen Mayor's arrival, ran to tell Mrs. Bannatyne, and she burst into the post office holding a large whip in her hand, and without hesitating she advanced on Mayor. She seized his nose between her fingers, and she gave him 5 or 6 strokes of the whip on various parts of his body. I can just visualize that. I quote, look, she said, this is how the women of Red River treat those who insult them. End of quote. The scene lasted for only half a minute, but by evening the incident was well known all across the countryside. End of quote. And really, there is much speculation on how much Bannatyne's assault on Mayor, the ignorant Canadian, became really, there's speculation on whether it became a symbolic catalyst for Louis Riel. And on February 25th, 1869, Le Nouveau Monde printed a letter from a half-breed signed L.R. And Riel takes Mayor to task for his observances on Red River life, especially its women. And this is part of the letter. I quote, you speak of a great many things that you have not had time to see or know, that would be worth as much as the reminder of your letter, as much as the scarcity courteous terms, I will even say barely civilized, which you use in speaking of the ladies of the country. Be it said in passing, Mr. Mayor, if we had only you as specimen of civilized men, we should not have a very high idea of them. If I wished to amuse myself by wielding the pen as you do for the sole pleasure of uttering follies to the world, I should have some amusing things to say on your account. End of quote. And it was signed L.R. And Anne's fighting spirit was not a one-of event. She really used her influence as the wife of a powerful man to really shape Winnipeg into a better place. And she convinced her husband and father to donate a large piece of land to be made into a hospital. And along with the ladies of the province, she helped to raise the majority of the funds needed to build the Winnipeg General Hospital, which is today known as the Health Sciences Center, of course, in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Anne was related directly and by marriage to some of the most influential families in the Red River settlement. Both Anne and her sister Sarah were aunts-in-law to Louis Riel, as well as cousins to a number of the members of the Legislative Assembly of Assiniboia, French, English, Catholic, and Protestant. Anne left the Red River. She really left a mark on the Red River, so she really did leave a mark. And it's interesting that Anne left the Red River before the province of Manitoba had been proclaimed. And in 1871, Anne's home became Manitoba's first legislative building and for the first meeting of the Manitoba legislature, which was held on March 15th. And on September 2nd, 1872, Anne's 10th child, daughter Margaret Fraser Bannatyne, was born, and December 3rd, 1873, the family home and the legislative building burnt to the ground, and thankfully there was no loss of life. In 1875, Anne would apply for scrip on behalf of herself and for her children. The same year, her Ladies' Association handed over $1,345.80 to help fund the Winnipeg General Hospital. And even though by this point in her life, Anne was surrounded by material luxury, she had experienced profound personal losses. Her daughter Elizabeth Gray Bannatyne died September 27th, 1878, 1879. And of course, the family patriarch, Anne's father, Andrew McDermott, died in 1881. And also in 1881, the Bannatynes began building a very ostentatious home in the new neighborhood for Winnipeg's well-to-do families that was under development at the bend of the Assiniboine River Armstrong Point. And the mansion at 158 Westgate was constructed of Tyndall stone and red sandstone and earned the nickname Bannatyne Castle. And while the house was under construction, the Bannatynes went traveling. They wintered at Hot Springs, Arkansas, and then sailed for England. And the 1880s took a heavy toll again on the family. Anne's son Roderick died June 14th, 1883. Daughter Margaret died September 25th, 1885. And on May 18th, 1889, while returning from Texas to Winnipeg for the summer, Anne's husband tragically died at St. Paul, Minnesota. She arranged a large civic funeral, of course, in Winnipeg, and her husband was buried at the Kildonan Cemetery. The turn of the century, Anne's family circle again diminished still more. Son Andrew died in 1900, and daughter Lorenda died in 1901. And sadly, herself, Anne died May 14th, 1908, at Kennington Manor, Saskatchewan, having outlived all but three of her children. And she had been visiting with daughter Anne and son-in-law Gerald John Simpson. Anne's funeral was held in Winnipeg, of course, with interment next to the grave of her husband Andrew Bannatyne in Kildonan Presbyterian Cemetery. An interesting note is, as postmaster in Louis Riel's provisional government, Andrew Bannatyne sought conciliation between Riel and the government of Canada. Together, Anne and Andrew Bannatyne left their mark on Manitoba. They inspired and enabled the development of the Health Sciences Center in Winnipeg. Bannatyne Avenue and École Bannatyne in Winnipeg are named after the family. So, indeed, Anne Bannatyne was a formidable Métis business owner, Métis woman, and a very important civic figure in Manitoba, Winnipeg, Manitoba. And Anne truly represents a strong Métis woman despite the severe discrimination that she faced. She really stood her ground, speaks up for herself, and she spoke up for other women, of course. And she was a strong advocate and really vocalized her opinion on the lies being spread about her community. She really was a force to be reckoned with. And they say Bannatyne Avenue, of course, in Winnipeg was named after Andrew Bannatyne, but in my opinion, it was named after his wife, Anne, as well. So I hope you enjoyed this episode in regards to a strong Métis woman, a force to be reckoned with, brought up in an affluential family in Winnipeg, but really used her position, her prominent position, to do good deeds and stand up against the discrimination, the racism against Métis people, specifically Métis women. So until next time, folks, stay well and take care. Thank you.